Left to freeze. With a note. "No one's child," Hell's Angel said. "You're mine now." The rumble of the motorcycle cut through the silent winter night, a lone sound against the backdrop of endless white. Daniel Cross hunched forward on his Harley, his broad shoulders tense against the biting cold that seeped through his leather jacket. Snowflakes danced in the beam of his headlight, swirling like tiny ghosts before disappearing into the darkness. The road stretched before him, empty and forgotten like so many things in his life. Daniel preferred it this way. Alone on back roads where nobody asked questions or expected answers. Where nobody knew him as Grave, the Hell's Angel, with eyes as hard as stone. His breath fogged inside his helmet as he exhaled slowly. 45 years of life, and what did he have to show for it? A small, weather-beaten house, a motorcycle, and memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. Daniel flexed his gloved fingers on the handlebars, fighting the numbness that wasn't entirely from the cold. That same numbness had settled in his chest years ago, making a home where warmth once lived. Sometimes he wondered if he even remembered how to feel anything at all. The bike's tires crunched over fresh snow as he leaned into a curve, the world tilting slightly before straightening again. The moon broke through the clouds momentarily, casting silver light across the landscape. In that brief illumination, Daniel caught sight of his own shadow stretching alongside him, dark, solitary, racing to keep up. Just like him. Always running. Never arriving. The forest closed in on both sides of the road, pine trees heavy with snow standing like silent sentinels. Daniel knew these backroads better than most. They were his escape when the clubhouse got too loud, when the brotherhood felt more like a cage than family. Out here, he could breathe. Out here, nobody expected him to be anyone. A deer bounded across the road 50 yards ahead, startling him from his thoughts. Daniel eased off the throttle, watching as the creature disappeared into the trees. He envied its freedom, its simple existence. No regrets, no ghosts. The wind picked up, sending a fresh flurry of snow across his path. Daniel squinted through his visor, slowing slightly as visibility decreased. The cold bit deeper now, finding the gaps in his clothing, reminding him he was still human despite everything. Human. The word almost made him laugh. He'd done his best to kill that part of himself years ago, after Emily left. After he'd failed at the one thing that mattered. Being a father. The memory came unwelcome, as it always did. His daughter's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as she told him she couldn't live like this anymore. Couldn't bear watching him destroy himself. Couldn't keep pretending his choices weren't breaking her heart. Daniel gritted his teeth and twisted the throttle, the engine roaring in response. Louder sounds to drown out louder thoughts. The road dipped suddenly, leading him into a small clearing where the trees pulled back from the pavement. A forgotten rest area, barely visible beneath the blanket of snow. A single streetlight flickered weakly, struggling against the darkness. Daniel would have ridden past without a second glance, as he had countless times before. But tonight, something caught his eye. A park bench, partially covered in snow, stood like an island in the sea of white. That wasn't unusual. What made Daniel slow his bike was what appeared to be on the bench. Something that didn't belong in this desolate, frozen place. The motorcycle's engine growled lower as he eased off the gas, his boots dragging slightly against the snow-packed road as he decreased speed. The headlight cut through swirling snowflakes, illuminating the bench more clearly now. Something small, something that seemed to move slightly. Daniel tilted his head, squinting through his frosted visor. The wind carried a sound to him, faint, almost lost in the howl of the winter night. He slowed his bike further, curiosity and caution battling within him as he approached the lonely park bench and whatever waited there in the cold. Daniel cut the engine, letting silence fall around him like the snow. The park bench stood 20 feet away, its wooden slats barely visible beneath white powder. His boots crunched as he dismounted, leaving deep impressions in the virgin snow. Something wasn't right. He removed his helmet, hooked it on the handlebar, and stood motionless. The winter air stung his face, chapping his lips instantly. His breath clouded in front of him, disappearing into the darkness. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his gruff voice sounding foreign in the emptiness. No answer came except the soft whistle of wind through barren trees. He took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The dim streetlight flickered overhead, threatening to give up its fight against the night. As he drew closer to the bench, the strange bundle became clearer. Something wrapped in what looked like a thin towel, crusted with ice along its edges. "What the hell?" he muttered, approaching cautiously like he would a wounded animal. 3 more steps, and Daniel froze. A sound, weak but unmistakable, came from the bundle. A whimper, then a cry, so faint it might have been the wind playing tricks. But Daniel knew better. He closed the distance in 2 long strides and stared down at the bench. A baby. Tiny. Face red from cold, wrapped in nothing but a threadbare towel. "Jesus Christ," Daniel breathed, his words forming white clouds that hovered over the infant. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, its cries growing weaker by the second. Beside it, propped against the bench's armrest, stood a piece of cardboard with words scrawled in black marker. "No one's child." Daniel's hands hung useless at his sides as his mind raced. Who would leave a baby out here, in this cold? The infant couldn't be more than a few weeks old. It would freeze to death within hours. Minutes, maybe. Without thinking, he reached down and touched the baby's cheek. Ice cold. The infant turned slightly toward his finger, seeking warmth. "You're gonna die out here, kid," Daniel said quietly. He looked around, searching for... what? The mother? Someone who would claim responsibility for this abandoned life? The empty rest area stared back, indifferent to his panic. Daniel pulled back his hand and took a step away from the bench. This wasn't his problem. He couldn't get involved. He should call someone, police, hospital, someone equipped to handle this. But cell service was spotty out here on the back roads. By the time he found a signal and help arrived. The baby coughed, a rattling sound that shook its tiny frame. "Damn it," Daniel whispered. He looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had thrown punches, fixed motorcycles, and held whiskey bottles, hands that hadn't held anything fragile in years, not since Emily was small. Emily. The thought of his daughter sent a jolt of pain through him, sharp enough to make him wince. The cardboard sign mocked him. No one's child. The words struck something deep inside him, something buried under years of carefully constructed indifference, because he knew what that meant. He knew exactly how it felt. Daniel turned away abruptly, walking back toward his motorcycle with heavy steps. This wasn't his business. He couldn't save everyone. Hell, he couldn't even save himself. He reached his bike and grabbed the handlebars, ready to swing his leg over the seat, ready to ride away and pretend he'd never seen the bench or its tiny occupant, ready to return to the comforting numbness that had carried him through the last 2 decades. But the baby's cry rose again, weaker this time, carried to him on the winter wind. Daniel stood frozen, one foot raised toward the motorcycle's footrest. His grip tightened on the handlebar until his knuckles ached beneath his gloves. That cry, so desperate, so alone. He remembered the cardboard sign. No one's child. Once, that had been him. Daniel paused, the baby's cries echoing behind him in the cold, empty night. Daniel couldn't move. His body hovered between his bike and the direction of the bench, caught in an invisible tug-of-war. The baby's cry had grown weaker, more intermittent, a bad sign. He knew that much. "Just keep going," he told himself, his voice rough in the silence. "Not your problem." But his feet wouldn't obey. Instead, fragments of memories flashed through his mind, images he'd spent decades trying to forget. A different winter, a different bench, a small boy with no coat, huddled against the cold, waiting for parents who never returned. Daniel had been 4 years old when they left him at that bus station in Millerville. He remembered the woman, his mother, kissing his forehead, telling him to wait right there. "Just 10 minutes, Danny. Be a good boy." He'd waited for hours, until his fingers turned blue, until a stranger finally called the police. Daniel shook his head hard, trying to dislodge the memories. His hand trembled on the handlebar. "Damn it all," he growled, turning back toward the bench. The snow had started falling heavier now, dusting the small bundle. The baby's cries had stopped completely. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs as he rushed forward, boots kicking up snow. When he reached the bench, relief washed over him. The infant's eyes were still closed, but its tiny chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Small puffs of vapor escaped its blue-tinged lips. Daniel stood over the child, unmoving. He was no savior. He was a man who'd spent 20 years running from responsibility, from connection. A man with a patch on his back that made people cross the street when they saw him coming. "I can't do this," he whispered. But he already knew he would. With hands that suddenly felt too large and clumsy, Daniel reached down and carefully picked up the baby. The towel fell away, revealing nothing but a thin onesie underneath. The infant was so small it fit in his 2 hands, weighing almost nothing. "Jesus, kid," Daniel muttered, quickly tucking the baby inside his leather jacket, against the warmth of his chest. "Who does this to a baby?" The cardboard sign still sat on the bench. Daniel grabbed it with his free hand, crumpling it in his fist before shoving it in his pocket. Evidence, he told himself, in case he needed to prove something later. But deep down, he knew the truth. He took it because those 3 words had followed him his entire life. No one's child. A label that had shaped everything he became. The baby stirred against his chest, making small sounds as warmth began returning to its tiny body. "Hang on," Daniel whispered. "Just hang on." He walked back to his motorcycle, the reality of what he was doing only now setting in. He couldn't exactly balance a newborn on his Harley. Not in this weather, not safely. His eyes scanned the deserted rest area, landing on a small shed used by maintenance workers. Worth a shot. Holding the baby close, Daniel trudged through the snow to the shed. The padlock was flimsy, one sharp tug with his free hand, and it broke. Inside, he found what he'd hoped for, a park service truck, probably used for grounds maintenance. "Sorry about this," he muttered, not entirely sure if he was apologizing to the baby or the absent park workers. Finding the keys was easy, hanging on a hook just inside the door. Hot wiring would have taken too long with the baby needing warmth fast. Daniel climbed into the truck, cranked the heat as high as it would go, and gently placed the baby on the passenger seat. The infant's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark blue, unfocused, before closing again. "You and me, kid," Daniel said, putting the truck in gear. He glanced at his abandoned motorcycle, knowing he'd have to come back for it later. "We're both left behind." As the truck pulled onto the empty road, Daniel glanced at the tiny passenger beside him. Something fierce and protective rose in his chest, a feeling so long dormant he barely recognized it. "You're mine now," he said, his voice soft but certain. And I won't leave you. Not ever. The truck's headlights cut through the falling snow as they drove away from the bench, away from abandonment, toward Daniel's small house on the edge of town. The headlights cut through the darkness as Daniel turned down the long gravel driveway leading to his house. The small, weather-beaten structure sat alone at the edge of town, a place where neighbors didn't ask questions and where he could keep to himself. Tonight, that isolation felt like a blessing. Daniel killed the engine and glanced at the baby bundled in his jacket. The tiny face had gained some color during the drive, pink returning to pale cheeks. Small fingers curled and uncurled as the infant slept. "Home sweet home," Daniel muttered, gathering the baby close to his chest. "Such as it is." He stepped out into the biting cold, snow crunching beneath his boots. The wind had picked up, throwing icy flakes against his face as he hurried toward the porch. The baby stirred against him, making small mewling sounds. "Almost there, kid. Almost there." The key fumbled in the lock, his fingers stiff with cold. When the door finally swung open, darkness greeted them. Daniel reached for the light switch with his elbow, illuminating a sparse living room. A worn leather couch, a coffee table cluttered with motorcycle parts, and a small TV in the corner. A thin layer of dust covered everything. Heat. The baby needed heat first. Daniel crossed to the thermostat and cranked it up, hearing the furnace groan to life somewhere in the basement. The house had been cold for days. He'd been gone on a long ride, not expecting to return with company. "What now?" he asked aloud, looking down at the small face pressed against his chest. The baby's eyes opened briefly, deep blue and unfocused, before closing again. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of his living room, the reality of what he'd done hitting him all at once. He had a baby, an actual baby, and he didn't have the first clue what to do with it. Food, sleep, warmth, he listed out loud, trying to remember the basics of what babies needed. "Let's figure out where you'll sleep first." Daniel carried the infant to his bedroom, a Spartan space with just a double bed and dresser. No crib, nothing even close to a crib. His eyes landed on the dresser. The bottom drawer was empty except for some old t-shirts. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do for now. "Temporary," he promised, pulling out the drawer and placing it on the bed. He lined it with the cleanest t-shirts he could find, creating a makeshift mattress. Then he emptied a pillowcase and rolled it into a small bumper around the edges. "Not exactly what they'd recommend in those baby books," he said, studying his handiwork. The baby needed a diaper change. That much was obvious from the smell. Daniel rummaged through his bathroom, finding an old package of clean shop rags he used when working on his bike. He grabbed a small dish towel from the kitchen. "Sorry, kid. This is all I've got right now." With trembling hands, Daniel unwrapped the baby completely for the first time. A boy. Tiny fingers, tiny toes, all accounted for. He looked small. Too small, and his skin still felt cool to the touch. Daniel fashioned a diaper from the cleanest rag, securing it with safety pins he found in a junk drawer. He wrapped the baby in the dish towel, then added his own flannel shirt on top for extra warmth. "There you go. That'll have to work until morning." The baby's face scrunched up, lips quivering. A thin cry escaped, growing stronger by the second. "Hungry?" Daniel guessed, panic rising in his chest. "What do I feed you?" He rushed to the kitchen, yanking open the refrigerator. The harsh light revealed his bachelor lifestyle in all its glory. Beer, leftover pizza, and condiments. Nothing for a baby. "Milk," he muttered, finding a carton in the back. "But can you drink regular milk? Don't babies need special stuff?" The crying grew louder. Daniel felt sweat breaking out on his forehead, despite the chill still lingering in the house. "Okay, Okay, he said, finding a small pot. He poured a little milk in, warming it gently on the stove. Finding an eyedropper in his first aid kit, he tested the milk on his wrist like he'd seen in movies. Back in the bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed, cradling the crying infant in one arm. The dropper felt ridiculous in his large, calloused hand as he carefully squeezed small drops of milk into the baby's mouth. The baby sputtered, milk dribbling down his chin, but then his tiny mouth latched onto the dropper, sucking desperately. "That's it," Daniel encouraged, his voice surprisingly gentle. "That's it." After what seemed like hours, the baby's eyes grew heavy again. Daniel placed him carefully in the makeshift drawer crib, tucking the flannel around him. The furnace had finally warmed the room, and the baby's face was peaceful in sleep. Daniel sank into the chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of the tiny chest. Exhaustion washed over him, but sleep seemed impossible. His mind raced with all the things he didn't know, all the things the baby would need. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he whispered, running a hand over his tired face. "I don't know the first thing about babies." Daniel jerked awake in the chair, his neck stiff from the awkward angle. The baby's cries pierced the quiet night, high-pitched and urgent. For a moment he blinked in confusion, the events of the evening rushing back to him. I'm here," he mumbled, rising from the chair. His joints protested as he leaned over the drawer to lift the tiny bundle. The baby's face was scrunched up tight, his skin flushed red with the effort of crying. Daniel held him against his chest, patting his back awkwardly. "What is it? Hungry again?" He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. Only 40 minutes had passed since the last feeding. The crying continued, unrelenting. Daniel carried the baby to the kitchen, jostling him gently with each step. The house was warm now, but outside, snow tapped against the windows like tiny fingers asking to be let in. "Let's try some more milk, huh?" Daniel said, his voice rough with fatigue. He warmed another small amount, testing it carefully on his wrist. Back in the living room, he settled into the old leather couch, cradling the baby in the crook of his arm. The dropper seemed even more inadequate now as the baby turned his head away, refusing the milk. "Come on, kid," Daniel coaxed. "You've got to eat something." The crying continued, tears streaming down the infant's reddened cheeks. Daniel tried everything he could think of, rocking, bouncing, walking in circles around the living room. Nothing helped. "What do you need?" he asked, feeling helpless. "I don't know what you need." 2 hours crawled by. The baby's cries had transformed into a hoarse, hiccuping sound that tore at something deep in Daniel's chest. His own eyes burned with exhaustion as he paced the floor, the baby held against his shoulder. He checked for a wet diaper, tried more milk, and even ran warm water in the sink to bathe the baby's feet, remembering something about that calming infants. Nothing worked. "Please," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. "Please tell me what you need." The digital clock on the microwave blinked 3:47 a.m. Outside, the world was buried under a blanket of snow and silence, while inside, the tiny house echoed with the sounds of an infant's distress and a man's growing desperation. Daniel sank onto the couch again, the baby cradled in his arms. Fatigue washed over him in heavy waves. The child's face was tear-stained, his tiny body tense with whatever discomfort plagued him. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Daniel murmured, brushing a calloused thumb over the baby's cheek. "Both of us lost in our own way." The crying softened slightly at the sound of his voice. Daniel shifted the baby higher against his chest, letting the small head rest near his heart. "You like that? Me talking?" he asked, surprised. He continued speaking, his voice low and rumbly. "I don't have any good stories to tell you. Nothing you'd want to hear anyway. For a moment, the crying lessened, but then started up again, with renewed vigor. Daniel sighed, leaning his head back against the couch. His mind searched for something, anything that might help. A distant memory surfaced, so faded it barely seemed real. The sensation of being held, a gentle rocking motion and a melody. Something from before everything went wrong, before he was left alone. Without thinking, Daniel began to hum. The tune was simple, slow, and a bit melancholy. A lullaby he couldn't remember learning but somehow knew. The notes vibrated in his chest, uncertain at first, then growing stronger. The baby's cries began to fade. Tiny eyelids fluttered, fighting against the pull of sleep. Daniel continued humming, surprised by how easily the melody came back to him after all these years. The infant's body relaxed against him. Small fingers uncurled from tight fists. Daniel held his breath, afraid to disturb this fragile peace. As the first hint of dawn colored the sky outside, the baby's eyes closed completely. His breathing deepened, each exhale a warm puff against Daniel's neck. The lullaby trailed off, leaving the room in perfect silence. Daniel stared down at the sleeping child, a strange feeling blooming in his chest, something between wonder and terror. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, hardly daring to move. "How did you know that was my song?" Early morning light filtered through the thin curtains, painting golden stripes across the living room floor. Daniel hadn't moved from the couch, afraid that any shift might disturb the peaceful sleep of the tiny bundle nestled against his chest. His arm had gone numb hours ago, but he didn't care. The baby's face was relaxed now, pink lips slightly parted with each gentle breath. Overnight, it seemed the infant's color had improved. No longer that alarming blue-tinged pallor from when Daniel had first found him on the bench. "You're a fighter," Daniel whispered, carefully brushing a finger across the baby's downy head. "Just like me." Outside, birds began their morning songs. The storm had passed during the night, and fresh snow blanketed everything in pristine white. It was a new day, the first day of whatever this was going to be. Daniel studied the sleeping face. Something about the peaceful expression reminded him of water, smooth and calm after a storm. It sparked a thought. "You need a name," he said softly. "Can't just keep calling you kid or baby." The infant's eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. Daniel thought about all the people he'd known in his life, searching for a name that might fit. None seemed right for this child who had survived abandonment in the freezing cold. "Noah," Daniel said suddenly, testing the sound of it. "Noah." The name felt right in his mouth, strong but gentle, a survivor's name. "That's who you are," Daniel continued, his voice barely audible. "Noah, because somehow you made it through the flood that was meant to wash you away." As if responding to his new identity, the baby, Noah, stretched his tiny arms, his face scrunching momentarily before settling back into sleep. Daniel carefully adjusted his position, wincing as blood began to flow back into his arm. The sudden pins and needles made him grit his teeth, but he managed to keep Noah steady. Reality was beginning to set in with the morning light. Daniel glanced around his sparse living room, seeing it through new eyes, seeing all the things it lacked for a baby. No crib, no diapers, no proper formula. Just a motorcycle gang member with rough hands and a makeshift drawer bed. "We need supplies," he muttered, "and I need to figure out what I'm doing." The thought of leaving the house with Noah made Daniel's heart rate pick up. People would see them together. There would be questions. And Daniel Cross, known as Grave to his fellow angels, wasn't exactly the picture of fatherhood material. But Noah needed things, real things, not just whatever Daniel could cobble together from his bachelor supplies. With slow, careful movements, Daniel rose from the couch. Noah stirred, but didn't wake as Daniel laid him back in the drawer, tucking the blankets around his small form. "Won't be long," Daniel promised, staring down at the sleeping baby. "Just gotta get you what you need." He moved quietly through the house, gathering his wallet and keys. At the door, he paused, suddenly uncertain. Was it safe to take an infant out in the cold? What if Noah started crying in the store? What if someone recognized the baby from a missing report? Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble. His mind raced with all the ways this could go wrong. But staying put wasn't an option. They needed supplies, and soon. He returned to the living room and looked down at Noah again. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil in his new guardian's mind. "All right," Daniel said with resolve. "We're doing this." He found an old duffel bag in his closet and emptied it of its contents, mostly tools and spare motorcycle parts. Then he lined it with his cleanest t-shirt, creating a nest of sorts. With extreme care, Daniel lifted the still sleeping Noah and placed him in the makeshift carrier. He wrapped his heaviest flannel shirt around the baby for extra warmth. "First stop, that big store on the edge of town," Daniel said, lifting the duffel bag with Noah inside. "Get you some proper clothes, food, and whatever else babies need." He grabbed his leather jacket and slipped it on, then paused at the mirror in the hallway. The reflection startled him. A hardened biker with tattoos peeking from his collar, holding a duffel bag with a tiny infant inside. It was the strangest sight he'd ever seen. Daniel adjusted his hold on the bag, making sure Noah was secure and comfortable. With a deep breath, he opened the front door, stepping out into the bright morning air. The bell above Maggie's diner door jingled as Daniel pushed it open with his shoulder, the duffel bag cradled carefully in his arms. The familiar smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air, but Daniel felt like a stranger in a place he'd visited hundreds of times before. "Just you and me, kid," he whispered to Noah, who was beginning to stir. The morning rush had passed, leaving only a few customers scattered throughout the diner. Daniel slid into the farthest booth, positioning the duffel bag gently on the seat beside him. Noah's eyes were open now, blinking up at the unfamiliar ceiling. Maggie Turner appeared at his table almost immediately, coffee pot in hand, and a warm smile on her face. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and her eyes crinkled at the corners when she spotted Daniel. "Well, look who's here bright and early. The usual, hun?" she asked, already pouring coffee into the mug in front of him. Daniel cleared his throat. "Actually, Maggie, I need some help." Her eyebrows lifted, and she set the coffee pot down. In all the years he'd been coming here, he'd never asked for anything beyond the occasional extra slice of toast. "What kind of help?" she asked, her voice dropping low with concern. Daniel hesitated, then carefully unzipped the duffel bag. Noah's face came into view, his tiny hands waving in the air. Maggie's mouth fell open. "Daniel Cross, whose baby is that?" "Mine," he said firmly, surprising himself with how natural the word felt. "His name is Noah." Maggie glanced around the diner, then slid into the booth across from him. "I'm going to need a lot more information than that." Daniel explained what had happened the night before, keeping his voice low. As he spoke, Noah began to fuss, his face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. "He's probably hungry," Maggie said, watching as Daniel awkwardly tried to comfort the baby. "When's the last time he ate?" Daniel checked his watch. "About 4 hours ago. I gave him some milk mixed with water." Maggie's eyes widened in alarm. "Regular milk. Daniel, babies need formula. Their stomachs can't handle cow's milk." Daniel felt his face flush with embarrassment. I didn't know. I was trying to keep him alive through the night. Maggie's expression softened. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You did good, bringing him in from the cold. But this little one needs proper care. Noah's fussing turned into a full cry. Several customers turned to look. Come with me, Maggie said, standing up. Right now. She led Daniel through the swinging kitchen doors and into a small office in the back of the diner. Once inside, she pulled out a chair. Sit, she commanded, and give me that little bundle. Daniel hesitated, then carefully handed Noah to Maggie. The woman cradled him with practiced ease, bouncing slightly as she held him. My daughter left some baby things here last time she visited with my grandson, she explained, opening a cabinet to reveal diapers, wipes, and a can of formula. We'll get this little one fixed up, and then we'll figure out what you need. For the next hour, Maggie showed Daniel how to change a diaper, prepare formula, and properly hold Noah for feeding. Daniel watched her movements carefully, trying to memorize every step. You're a natural, Maggie said, smiling as Noah contentedly sucked on the bottle Daniel was now holding. Daniel snorted. I don't feel natural. I feel like I'm gonna break him. Babies are tougher than they look, Maggie assured him, but you need supplies, real supplies. She wrote a detailed list on the back of an order ticket. Diapers, formula, bottles, baby clothes, a proper car seat, blankets, and more items Daniel hadn't even considered. This is going to cost a fortune, he muttered, scanning the list. It's what babies need, Maggie said simply, and if money's tight, I can help. Daniel shook his head. I've got money, just never had a reason to spend it before. Maggie patted his shoulder. You do now. Before Daniel left, Maggie packed a bag with enough supplies to last a day or two and promised to check in on them soon. She hugged him at the door, which caught Daniel off guard. You're doing a good thing, she whispered. I always knew there was more to you than that tough biker act. Evening shadows stretched across Daniel's living room as he sat in his worn armchair, watching Noah sleep in the makeshift crib. The supplies from Maggie were spread across his coffee table. Clean bottles, formula, tiny diapers that looked impossibly small in his rough hands. Noah's chest rose and fell with each tiny breath. His face was peaceful now, a stark contrast to the panicked cries that had filled the house just hours before. Daniel leaned back, exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He hadn't slept more than a couple hours since finding Noah, but his mind wouldn't quiet. The lullaby he'd hummed earlier played on repeat in his thoughts. "Rock-a-bye, little one," he whispered, the words coming back to him from some dusty corner of memory. "Rest now. Sleep tight." It wasn't a common lullaby, not something you'd hear just anywhere. It was personal, specific, and Noah had responded to it instantly. Daniel closed his eyes, letting himself drift back. He could almost feel the cold of that winter night decades ago. He must have been about 4 years old, huddled on a park bench, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, a cardboard sign propped beside him. No one's child. Hours had passed before someone found him. A police officer with kind eyes and a gentle voice. The man had hummed that same lullaby while they waited for social services to arrive. "Strange coincidence, huh, kid?" Daniel murmured to the sleeping baby. But was it coincidence? The same bench, the same cruel message, the same lullaby soothing a frightened child. Daniel stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the curtain to stare out at the night sky. Stars dotted the blackness like distant promises. When was the last time he'd actually looked at the stars? Years, probably. The lullaby had been his secret comfort through years in foster care. He'd hummed it to himself when homes got rough, when families sent him back, when the loneliness threatened to swallow him whole. Later, he'd hummed it to his own daughter, Emily, before everything fell apart. Daniel's chest tightened at the memory of Emily's tiny hands reaching for him, her sleepy smile as he'd sung her to sleep. Then came the bitter flash of her mother taking her away, of Courts deciding he wasn't fit to be a father. The years of searching, hoping, eventually giving up. He turned back to look at Noah. This unexpected gift left in the exact spot where his own life had been derailed. "Who left you there?" Daniel asked softly. "And why there, of all places?" The coincidence was too perfect, too specific. Someone who knew his history had deliberately placed Noah where Daniel would find him. He walked over to the duffel bag he'd been carrying Noah in and reached into the side pocket, pulling out the thin towel the baby had been wrapped in. He hadn't examined it closely before. Now, in the dim lamplight, he searched every inch, looking for clues. Nothing. Just a plain, worn blue towel. Daniel sank back into his chair, mind racing. Tomorrow he needed to go back to that bench. He needed to search the area properly, look for anything he might have missed in his hurry to get Noah someplace warm. Noah stirred, making tiny sounds in his sleep. Daniel found himself smiling despite the weight of questions pressing down on him. Whatever the reason, whatever the connection, this child needed him. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel needed someone too. "We'll figure it out tomorrow, little man," Daniel whispered. "First thing in the morning, we're going back to that bench." He set an alarm on his phone, something he rarely needed to do. Then he settled deeper into the chair, keeping watch over Noah as night deepened around them, the lullaby still echoing softly in his mind. Morning came too quickly. Daniel had dozed in his chair, waking every time Noah stirred. His back ached from the awkward position, but he felt more alert than he expected. Purpose had a way of clearing the mind. Daniel fed Noah and changed him with hands that felt slightly less clumsy than before. He bundled the baby in the warmest blankets from Maggie's supplies, tucking them carefully around the tiny body. "Let's go find some answers," he said softly. Outside, frost sparkled on his motorcycle, beautiful but impractical. Daniel frowned, realizing he couldn't take Noah on the bike. He hadn't thought about transportation when he'd taken in the baby. After a moment of consideration, he walked to the small shed behind his house and pulled open the door. Inside sat an old pickup truck he rarely used, covered in dust but still functional. "Been a while," Daniel muttered, brushing cobwebs from the driver's seat. He carefully placed Noah in the middle of the bench seat, using blankets to create a secure nest. Not exactly safe, but it would have to do for the short drive. He made a mental note to add a car seat to his growing list of necessities. The truck started with a reluctant grumble. Daniel drove slowly through the quiet streets, the morning sun casting long shadows across the road. Noah slept peacefully beside him, untroubled by the truck's gentle rocking. When they reached the park, Daniel parked close to the entrance. The area looked different in daylight, less ominous, more ordinary. A small neighborhood park with worn equipment, bare trees, and empty benches. No one was around yet. It was too early and too cold for casual visitors. Daniel lifted Noah carefully, cradling him against his chest as he walked toward the bench where he'd found him. Snow still covered much of the ground, though the bench itself had been mostly cleared by his movements the night before. He stood there for a long moment, just staring at the wooden slats. What had he expected to find? A note? A clue? The bench offered nothing new. Daniel sat down, holding Noah close for warmth. The baby's eyes opened briefly, then closed again in sleep. From this vantage point, Daniel could see the entire park. The rusty swing set, the tilted merry-go-round, the cracked sidewalk winding through naked trees. Something tugged at his memory. That sidewalk. The peculiar way it curved around a large oak tree before straightening again. The metal trash can at the corner, dented on one side. Daniel's breath caught. He knew this place, not just the bench, the entire park. Slowly he stood up. With Noah secure in his arms, he walked the perimeter, noting landmarks that had weathered decades of seasons. The 3 steps leading down to a small pond, now frozen over. The brick wall with missing mortar in the shape of a rough triangle. The iron fence with one bent spike. Memory layered over reality like a double exposure. He could see it all as it had been. Himself as a child, sitting alone, waiting for someone who never returned. Daniel stopped walking when he reached the bench again. This wasn't just a similar location. This was the exact bench where he had been left, the very spot where his life had been forever altered. He looked down at Noah, suddenly understanding the impossible connection. Someone knew. Someone had deliberately recreated his abandonment with chilling precision. "This is where I was left," Daniel whispered to Noah, his voice rough with emotion. "Right here. Same bench, same park." Noah blinked up at him, eyes unfocused but somehow attentive. Daniel sat down heavily on the bench, mind racing through possibilities. Who would know about his past? Who would leave a baby here, knowing Daniel might find him? Most of his childhood records were sealed. Few people knew his story, and fewer still knew this specific location. He scanned the area again, searching for anything he might have missed. His eyes caught on something half buried in the snow near the leg of the bench. Something white peeking out from underneath. Daniel reached down, careful not to disturb Noah, and brushed away the snow. A small corner of paper was visible, pushed deep under the bench, protected from the worst of the weather. It didn't look like ordinary litter. It looked intentional. Daniel reached carefully under the bench, balancing Noah against his chest with one arm. His fingers brushed against the paper, pinched it, and pulled. It was stuck, wedged between the wooden slats. He tugged harder, and it came free with a soft tear. It wasn't paper. It was a corner of a plastic bag, the kind hospitals use for personal belongings. The rest of the bag remained trapped beneath the bench. Daniel shifted Noah to his other arm and knelt down, ignoring the cold seeping through his jeans. He reached further under the bench, feeling around until his fingers found the plastic. "Come on," he muttered, working his hand around the bag. After a few attempts, he managed to pull it free. The small, clear bag was dirty and wet from snow, but intact. Daniel sat back on the bench and balanced Noah on his lap while he examined his find. Inside was a folded blanket, small and blue with little ducks printed on it. He opened the bag carefully, making sure nothing would spill out. The blanket was damp at the edges but mostly dry inside. Daniel unfolded it gently. Something fell into his lap. A small plastic bracelet. A hospital ID band, the kind they put on newborns. Daniel picked it up, his heart beating faster. The bracelet was intact, but water had smudged some of the print. He could make out part of a name. Baby Carr, followed by what might be an O or an A. The rest was illegible, blurred beyond recognition. "Cror," Daniel whispered, turning the bracelet over in his fingers. "Could be anything. Cross? Crow?" Noah squirmed in his arms, making small noises that Daniel was beginning to recognize as hunger signals. The morning was growing brighter, and a few early dog walkers had entered the far side of the park. Daniel carefully tucked the bracelet and blanket back into the plastic bag and stood up. "Time to go home, little man," he said to Noah. "We got what we came for." The drive back was slower than before, Daniel's mind racing with possibilities. The bracelet wasn't conclusive proof of anything, but it confirmed his suspicion that Noah's appearance on that bench wasn't random. Someone had left these clues for him to find. But who? And why? At home, Daniel warmed a bottle for Noah, his movements becoming more practiced with each feeding. He settled into his chair with the baby cradled in his arms, watching the tiny mouth work at the bottle. Noah's eyes, deep blue and somehow old, stared up at him with what Daniel fancied was curiosity. "You and me both, kid," Daniel said. "Lot of questions, not many answers." After the feeding, Daniel placed Noah in his makeshift crib for a nap. The baby was settling into a rhythm now, sleeping more predictably. Daniel took the opportunity to examine his find more carefully. He spread a clean towel on the kitchen table and emptied the contents of the plastic bag. The little blue blanket was higher quality than he'd initially thought. Soft flannel with carefully stitched edges. The hospital bracelet lay beside it, small and white against the dark wood of the table. Daniel turned on the overhead light and leaned closer, studying the bracelet. The plastic was slightly yellowed with age, but the band was intact. He squinted at the smudged letters, trying to make sense of what remained. "Baby car," he read aloud. The next letter might be an O or an A or even an E, followed by what could be an S or a 5. The date was partially visible. He could make out a 1 and a 2, possibly December. Daniel ran his finger over the letters, something tugging at his memory. He reached for his wallet and pulled out an old, creased photo, the only one he carried. A small girl with dark hair, smiling gap-toothed at the camera. He turned it over to read the faded writing on the back. Emily Cross, age 6. His breath caught as he looked back at the bracelet. "Cross," he said softly. "Baby Cross." The partial name wasn't just familiar. It was his own. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by a mess of supplies from the diner and drugstore. He'd spread everything out in neat rows, like he was planning a military operation. Diapers, wipes, formula, bottles, a few tiny outfits Maggie had given him. He studied each item carefully, determined to get this right. "Okay, Noah," he said to the baby lying in his drawer bed. "Let's figure this out together." The first diaper change of the morning went better than yesterday's attempts. Daniel's large hand still felt clumsy with the tiny tabs, but he managed without getting anything on himself this time. Noah kicked his legs and made soft, cooing sounds. "That's better, isn't it?" Daniel said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. No one had heard him speak this way in years. He'd read the instructions on the formula can 3 times, measuring the powder carefully and testing the temperature on his wrist like Maggie had shown him. When the bottle was ready, he lifted Noah and cradled him in the crook of his arm, supporting his head the way the pamphlet illustrated. Noah latched onto the bottle immediately, his tiny hands waving in the air. Daniel watched in wonder as the formula level slowly dropped. Something warm spread through his chest. Pride, maybe. He'd done this right. "You were hungry, huh? Good thing one of us knows what we're doing," Daniel said with a small smile. Between feedings, Daniel set up a proper changing station on his dresser. He lined a shallow basket with a soft blanket for diapers and wipes, placing it within easy reach. Each small improvement to his home made it feel less like the empty shell it had been for years. By midday, Daniel had established a rough schedule. Feed, change, nap, repeat. He found himself watching the clock, anticipating Noah's needs before the crying started. During one of Noah's naps, Daniel quickly showered and changed his clothes, keeping the bathroom door open so he could hear any sounds. The afternoon brought a new challenge when Noah began crying inconsolably after a feeding. Daniel tried everything, changing, rocking, walking around the house, but nothing worked. Frustration built inside him, threatening to overflow. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice tight with helplessness. Then he remembered something Maggie had mentioned about burping. Daniel carefully positioned Noah against his shoulder, supporting his neck, and gently patted his back. After a few minutes, a tiny burp escaped, followed by blessed silence. "There we go," Daniel said, relief washing over him. "That's what you needed." As the day wore on, Daniel found himself talking to Noah more and more. At first he felt foolish speaking to someone who couldn't understand or answer back, but there was something freeing about it, like opening a door that had been locked for years. "I've got no idea what I'm doing," he admitted as he folded a tiny shirt. "But I'm trying. That counts for something, right?" Each small victory boosted his confidence. By evening, he'd successfully given Noah a sponge bath, using a shallow basin of warm water and moving quickly to keep him from getting cold. He dressed him in clean clothes and wrapped him in a fresh blanket, surprised by how natural the motions were becoming. After the evening feeding, Daniel sat in his chair by the window. Noah nestled against his chest. The house was quiet, except for their breathing, and outside snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady. Daniel felt a rare moment of peace. "You and me against the world, kid," he whispered. Noah stirred, his tiny hand emerging from the blanket. Daniel watched as those miniature fingers opened and closed, reaching for nothing in particular. He extended his index finger, offering it to the baby. Noah's hand closed around it, gripping with surprising strength. Something shifted inside Daniel at that moment. The small pressure of those fingers around his own reached places in his heart he'd thought were dead forever. This wasn't just a responsibility he'd taken on. This was a connection. A bond forming between two souls who had both been abandoned, who both knew what it meant to be left behind. Daniel swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. He looked down at Noah's face, peaceful in the dim light, and at those tiny fingers wrapped around his own. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "And somehow you've got me too." Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of Daniel's living room. He'd been awake for hours already, having settled into Noah's schedule rather than fighting against it. The baby's needs had become the heartbeat of his days. 6 o'clock feeding, check, Daniel muttered to himself as he gently set Noah back in his makeshift crib. He glanced at the notebook he'd started keeping on the coffee table. Each feeding, diaper change, and nap was carefully recorded in his blocky handwriting. The routine gave him structure, something to hold on to in this new life that had crashed into his old one. Daniel moved around the kitchen with newfound purpose, washing bottles and preparing formula for the day ahead. His movements were more confident now, less hesitant. Just 3 days ago, he'd stared at the canister of formula like it contained secret codes. Now he measured scoops without thinking, testing temperatures with practiced ease. After Noah's morning nap, Daniel bundled him up against the winter chill. He'd fashioned a carrier from a sturdy scarf, securing Noah against his chest. His leather jacket zipped partway over both of them, keeping the baby warm against his body heat. "We've got errands to run, little man," he told Noah, who blinked up at him with those deep blue eyes. "The cupboards don't stock themselves." The motorcycle stayed parked. Instead, Daniel walked the 6 blocks to the small grocery store, hyper-aware of each step, of how precious his cargo was. People stared as he passed. A large, rough-looking man with a baby strapped to his chest was not a common sight in their small town. Daniel ignored the curious glances, focusing only on Noah's steady breathing against him. In the store, he navigated the aisles methodically, consulting the list he'd made that morning. More formula, diapers, something easy he could eat one-handed while holding Noah. The cashier, a young woman who usually eyed him with apprehension, softened when she saw the baby. "How old?" she asked, scanning his items. "Not sure exactly," Daniel replied honestly. "Young." She nodded, not pressing for more information. "You're doing great with him. My brother has a little one, and he still looks terrified half the time." Daniel just nodded, but something in him warmed at her words. After the grocery store, they stopped by the pharmacy for baby lotion and more wipes. The pharmacist recommended a gentle cream for the slight rash forming on Noah's neck. Daniel listened carefully to the instructions, mentally adding this new task to his growing list of baby care knowledge. By afternoon, they had returned home, and Daniel had settled into the rhythm of Noah's next feeding. The baby seemed more alert today, his eyes tracking Daniel's movements around the room. "You're noticing things, aren't you?" Daniel said softly. "Getting stronger already." He changed Noah's diaper, applying the new cream with careful fingers. His hands, once used mainly for fixing motorcycles and throwing punches, were learning gentleness. He noticed how Noah's skin had lost the reddish tinge from when he'd found him, how his cries had grown stronger and more insistent. As evening approached, Daniel heated some soup while Noah napped. The quiet of the house no longer felt empty, but peaceful. He'd just finished eating when a soft knock came at the door. Instantly alert, he checked that Noah was secure before answering. Maggie stood on his porch, a cloth bag in her hands. "Thought you might need a few things," she said by way of greeting. Daniel stepped back to let her in, suddenly aware of the clutter of baby supplies scattered around his usually sparse living room. "Place looks different," Maggie observed, setting her bag on the table. "Looks lived in now." She moved to the makeshift crib and peeked in at Noah, who had just begun to stir. "May I?" she asked, hands hovering. Daniel nodded, watching as she lifted Noah with practiced ease, cradling him against her shoulder. "You're feeding him enough," she said approvingly. "He's got good color now. You've been taking good care of him, Daniel." "Just doing what needs to be done," he replied. But Maggie's praise settled warmly in his chest. She watched him prepare a bottle, nodding at his technique. "You've got a knack for this," she said. "Some people never get the hang of it, even with their own kids." "It's not rocket science," Daniel muttered. "No, but it's heart science," Maggie replied. "And that's harder for some folks." She handed Noah back to him, watching as the baby nestled comfortably in his arms. "He knows you now, trusts you." Daniel looked down at Noah, who gazed back with complete faith in his eyes. The weight of that trust hit him all at once. How this tiny being depended on him completely, how he'd somehow become worthy of that dependence. "You're getting attached," Maggie said softly, not a question but an observation. Daniel didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The way his large hand gently supported Noah's head, the softness around his eyes when he looked at the baby, these spoke volumes. "It suits you," Maggie said simply. "Fatherhood." Morning frost coated Daniel's windows as he carefully packed Noah's diaper bag. He'd never owned such a thing before, but Maggie had brought one over, blue with tiny sailboats, stuffed with essentials. "It's just a quick trip," Daniel told Noah as he secured him in the car seat he'd purchased yesterday. The old pickup truck he rarely used had become their transportation. His motorcycle sat covered in the garage, a relic of his former life. Noah gurgled in response, his tiny fingers grasping at nothing. Daniel tucked a blanket around him and checked it 3 times before closing the door. The hospital bracelet sat heavy in Daniel's pocket. He'd stared at it for hours last night after Maggie left, tracing the partial name with his finger. Only a few letters were visible, but they pulled at something deep in his memory. The drive to Riverdale Clinic took 20 minutes. It was a small medical center that served several surrounding towns. Daniel had chosen it because the bracelet's faded logo matched theirs. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the building came into view. A low brick structure with 2 bright windows reflecting the morning sun. Daniel parked far from the entrance, taking his time gathering Noah and the diaper bag. He wasn't used to this, to carrying a baby into public places, to asking questions, to caring about answers. For years, he'd lived in the shadows of his own life. Now he was stepping into the light, and it made his skin prickle with unease. "We'll be quick," he promised Noah, who watched him with those trusting blue eyes. Inside, the clinic hummed with quiet activity. A few patients sat in plastic chairs, flipping through old magazines. The reception desk was staffed by a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze flickering between Daniel and Noah. Daniel shifted the baby in his arms. "I need information about this," he said, placing the hospital bracelet on the counter. The receptionist picked it up, frowning slightly. "This is pretty old and damaged." She looked at Noah, clearly doing mental calculations. "Is this his?" "Yes," Daniel lied smoothly. "Found it in some paperwork. Need to know which doctor was assigned." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll see what I can find, but you should talk to Nancy. She's been here forever, knows all the records." She pointed toward a hallway. "Nurses' station, second door." Daniel thanked her with a nod and headed down the corridor, Noah secure against his chest. The smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner reminded him of the few times he'd been in hospitals, never for anything good. The nurse's station was empty, except for an older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun. She looked up as Daniel approached, her professional smile warming when she spotted Noah. "Well, hello there, little one," she said, standing. "What can I do for you two?" Daniel placed the bracelet on the counter. "Need information about this. It's faded, but I'm trying to trace it." Nancy picked up the bracelet carefully, examining it under the bright desk lamp. "This is one of ours, all right. At least 5 years old, though. Maybe more." She glanced at Noah. "Definitely not this little fellow's." Daniel remained silent, letting her draw her own conclusions. "Let me see what I can find," she said, turning to her computer. "There's a serial number here, partially visible." Her fingers tapped efficiently on the keyboard. Noah began to fuss, and Daniel gently bounced him, patting his back the way Maggie had shown him. The nurse watched this interaction with knowing eyes. "You're good with him," she observed. "He settles well for you." Daniel just nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "Here we go," Nancy said finally, peering at her screen. "This bracelet was issued to a newborn." She trailed off, looking up at Daniel. "I can't give you specific information without proper authorization. Patient confidentiality." "I don't need details," Daniel said quietly. "Just the surname. It's important." Nancy studied his face, then looked at Noah. Something in her expression softened. "The surname associated with this bracelet is Cross." She watched him carefully. "Does that help you?" Daniel felt the floor shift beneath him. Cross. His name. A name he hadn't heard connected to anyone but himself in decades. "Yes," he managed to say, his voice rough. "That helps?" Daniel stumbled out of the clinic doors, Noah held tightly against his chest. The morning sun felt too bright now, the air too thin. He made it to his truck and carefully secured Noah in the car seat, his movements mechanical and precise, despite the storm raging inside him. Cross. His name. He sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. Noah made soft cooing sounds in the back, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shaken Daniel's world. "Not now," Daniel muttered, forcing himself to turn the key. "Think later." The drive back was a blur. Daniel pulled into the gravel driveway of his small house and shut off the engine. But he couldn't move. Noah had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with peaceful breaths. Daniel got out slowly and retrieved his motorcycle from the garage. He needed to think, and he always thought best when he was alone with the rumble of the engine beneath him. He wheeled the bike out into the driveway, then hesitated, looking back at the truck where Noah slept. For a moment, he stood frozen between his old life and his new one. Then he turned and knocked on his neighbor's door. Mrs. Wilson, a retired teacher who had been surprisingly kind to him over the years, answered quickly. "Daniel? Is everything all right? Could you watch Noah? He's sleeping in the truck. I need—" Daniel struggled to find the words. "I need an hour." Mrs. Wilson's eyes softened with understanding. "Of course. Take your time." Daniel nodded his thanks, then mounted his bike. The familiar vibration as it roared to life usually brought comfort. Today, it only underscored how much had changed. He rode without direction, the cold air stinging his face. Cross. There were millions of people with that surname, but the coincidence was too great. Noah had been left at the exact spot where Daniel had been abandoned as a child. And now this. A hospital bracelet with his own last name. There was only one possibility that made any sense, and it opened a wound Daniel had spent 20 years trying to forget. Emily. His daughter's face floated before him, not as he'd last seen her, angry and tearful at 17, but as she'd been as a small child. Dark hair like his, serious eyes that lit up when she laughed. Tiny hands that had once held his with complete trust. Daniel pulled over at a lookout point overlooking the valley. He cut the engine and sat in silence, memories washing over him like waves. Emily had been the one good thing in his broken life. Her mother had left when Emily was just 4, unable to handle Daniel's growing involvement with the Hells Angels. For years, it had been just the two of them. Daniel juggling his club duties with single fatherhood, often failing at both. As Emily entered her teens, the distance between them grew. She'd begged him to leave the life, to be the father she needed. But Daniel had been too far gone, too committed to his brothers, too afraid of starting over. The final fight came on her 17th birthday. Words like knives, doors slamming, Emily packing a bag, telling him she was going to live with her aunt in another state. "You choose them over me every time," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "So I'm making the choice easy for you." Daniel had let her go, telling himself it was for the best. She deserved better than a father who couldn't give up the life. He'd told himself she'd be safer, happier without him. He never tried to find her, never called the aunt to check on her. The shame was too great, the fear of rejection too overwhelming. That was almost 8 years ago. Could Emily have had a baby? Could she have found herself alone, desperate, with nowhere to turn? Did she know where he lived now? Had she left her child? His grandchild, where she knew he would find him? The questions circled like vultures as Daniel started his bike again and headed home. By the time night fell, Noah was fed and bathed, sleeping peacefully in his makeshift crib. Daniel sat beside him in the darkness, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. He studied Noah's face, really studied it for the first time. The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw. Even in sleep, there was something familiar there, something Daniel saw every day in the mirror. "My grandson," he whispered, the words barely audible. The revelation settled over him like a heavy blanket. warm but weighted with responsibility, with questions, with a past he couldn't escape. Noah was Emily's son, his grandson. The early morning sun peeked through the blinds, casting thin stripes of light across the wooden floor. Daniel had been up for hours already. He sat at his small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he sketched on a piece of paper. The rough outline of a crib took shape under his calloused fingers. "What do you think of this, Noah?" he asked, glancing at the baby lying on a blanket nearby. Noah kicked his legs in response, tiny hands reaching toward the ceiling. Daniel smiled. "I'll take that as approval." He'd spent half the night thinking about Emily, about the possibility that Noah was his grandson. The truth felt right in his bones. He couldn't explain it, but the connection was there, in Noah's eyes, in the way the lullaby calmed him, in the undeniable fact that he'd been left at the exact spot where Daniel himself had once been abandoned. Whatever Emily's reasons, she had trusted him with her son. And Daniel was determined not to fail either of them again. After finishing his coffee, Daniel bundled Noah up and secured him in the truck. Their first stop was the hardware store on Main Street. Daniel hadn't built much since his younger days, but he remembered enough. He filled his cart with lumber, sandpaper, paint, and tools. "Building something special?" the cashier asked as she rang him up. "A crib," Daniel replied, his voice gruff but proud. "For my grandson." The words felt strange on his tongue, but right. For the first time, he was claiming Noah not just as a child he'd found, but as family. Their next stop was a department store where Daniel bought proper baby furniture, a changing table, a rocking chair, soft blankets, and tiny clothes that Noah wouldn't outgrow in a week. He even picked out colorful wall decorations, smiling animals and bright stars that seemed to promise better days ahead. By noon, they were back home, and Daniel set to work. He placed Noah in the center of the living room where he could watch, surrounding him with toys that Maggie had donated. "This is going to be your room," Daniel explained as he cleared out his small home office. "I never used this space much anyway." As he worked, measuring and cutting wood, sanding down rough edges to prevent splinters, Daniel talked to Noah about everything and nothing. He described how to build things properly, told stories about the town, and even shared memories of when Emily was small. "Your mom used to love watching me fix things," he said, his voice catching. "She'd sit right where you are, asking a million questions." Noah gurgled in response, his eyes following Daniel's movements. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Daniel assembled the changing table and rocking chair, hung cheerful curtains, and carefully painted the walls a soft blue. The homemade crib took shape hour by hour, not fancy, but solid and safe. As the sun began to set, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text from Vic, his club president. "Meeting tonight, mandatory, 9 p.m. Daniel stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply button. 6 months ago, he would have dropped everything for a club meeting. The Hells Angels had been his only family for years, the only place he'd felt he belonged after losing Emily. But now, as he looked around the half-finished nursery, at Noah sleeping peacefully in his temporary bed, something shifted inside him. The club had given him brotherhood when he needed it most. But it had also cost him his daughter. And now that he had a second chance, this unexpected gift of family, could he risk losing it again? Daniel set his phone down without replying and picked up his tools again. He worked until the crib was finished, sanding the edges one final time before setting it in the corner of the nursery. He carefully lifted Noah and placed him in his new bed, watching as the baby settled into the soft mattress without waking. Standing in the doorway of the freshly painted room, Daniel made his decision. He couldn't be both the man he was and the grandfather Noah needed. It was time to leave the life behind. Morning sunlight filtered through the new blue curtains, casting a gentle glow across Noah's nursery. Daniel stood in the doorway, a bottle of warm formula in his hand, watching as the baby stirred and stretched his tiny arms. For a moment, Daniel just observed, taking in the peaceful sight of Noah waking up in the crib he had built with his own hands. "Morning, little man," Daniel said softly as he approached. Noah's eyes found his, and a toothless smile spread across the baby's face. Something warm expanded in Daniel's chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it as happiness. He lifted Noah carefully, cradling him in the crook of his arm. "Sleep good in your new bed?" he asked, settling into the rocking chair. Noah grabbed eagerly for the bottle, his small fingers pressing against Daniel's rough hands. The quiet routine of feeding, changing, and playing had become the center of Daniel's world in just a few short days. Each small moment, each diaper successfully changed, each giggle coaxed from Noah's mouth, felt like a victory. After breakfast, Daniel dressed Noah in one of the new outfits he'd bought. Tiny jeans and a soft blue sweater that made his eyes look even brighter. "Looking sharp, kid," Daniel said with a smile. "Ready to see the world today?" He bundled Noah into a warm jacket and secured him in the baby carrier he'd finally figured out how to use properly. Together, they headed out into the crisp morning air. Their first stop was the small community park just a few blocks from Daniel's house. Not the one where he'd found Noah, but a cheerful place with swings and a small pond where ducks gathered. Daniel had never paid much attention to it before, despite living nearby for years. "See those? Those are ducks," Daniel explained, pointing toward the water. Noah followed his finger with curious eyes. "Maybe when you're bigger, we can bring bread to feed them." A young mother pushing a stroller smiled at them as she passed. "How old?" she asked, nodding toward Noah. "About 3 months, I think," Daniel replied, surprising himself with how easily he engaged in conversation. Before Noah, he would have given a short nod at most, keeping people at a distance. "He's beautiful," the woman said. "Enjoy every minute. They grow so fast." Daniel nodded. "I'm learning that." As they continued their walk, Daniel pointed out trees, cars, and clouds, narrating the world for Noah's benefit. The simple joy of introducing someone to life for the first time filled him with purpose. After lunch at home, Daniel placed Noah on a blanket in the living room, surrounding him with colorful toys. He sat on the floor nearby, watching as Noah batted at a hanging mobile with determined concentration. "You're going to be good with your hands," Daniel observed proudly. "Maybe you'll build things someday, too." When Noah grew tired, Daniel sang the lullaby that always seemed to soothe him, rocking gently until the baby's eyes fluttered closed. He placed him in the crib for his afternoon nap, and used the time to tidy up, still marveling at how thoroughly his bachelor existence had been transformed in just a few days. In the evening, they sat together in the rocking chair, Daniel reading aloud from a children's book Maggie had dropped off. The colorful pictures seemed to captivate Noah, his eyes wide as Daniel turned each page. "The hungry caterpillar ate through one apple," Daniel read, his deep voice softened for Noah's benefit. "But he was still hungry." Noah cooed in response, a sound that made Daniel chuckle. "You understand that feeling, don't you? Always hungry?" After a final bottle and a diaper change, Daniel settled Noah in his crib for the night. He stood watching for a few minutes as the baby drifted off to sleep, peaceful and trusting. "Good night, Noah," he whispered, carefully adjusting the blanket. "I'll be right here if you need me." Daniel moved quietly through the house, tidying up bottles and baby clothes. He felt a deep contentment he hadn't experienced in decades, perhaps ever. For the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond simply making it through another day. Just as he was settling into his armchair with a cup of tea, a firm knock sounded at the door. Daniel frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 11, too late for casual visitors. Setting his mug down, he moved quietly to the door, not wanting the noise to wake Noah. When he opened it, his heart froze. 2 uniformed police officers stood on his porch, their expressions serious. "Daniel Cross?" the taller officer asked. Daniel nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. "We need to talk to you about a baby that was reported missing 4 days ago." Daniel's world collapsed with each word the officer spoke. "We received a report about a missing infant," the tall officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. "We have reason to believe the child may be here." Daniel's throat tightened. "His name is Noah," he said, barely above a whisper. "I found him abandoned in the park. There was a sign that said, 'No one's child.'" The second officer, a woman with short blonde hair, exchanged glances with her partner. "May we come in, sir?" Daniel stepped back, his movements mechanical. The officers entered his home, the space that had transformed from a cold shelter to a warm haven in just days. "How long ago did you find this baby?" the female officer asked, notebook in hand. 4 days ago, Daniel admitted. "I know I should have called it in, but—" He trailed off, unable to explain the pull he'd felt, the connection, the strange familiarity. "Sir, taking a child without reporting it is a serious offense," the male officer said. "Even with good intentions." Daniel's eyes darted towards the hallway leading to Noah's room. He was freezing, crying. I couldn't just leave him there. "We understand you may have been trying to help," the female officer said, her voice gentler. "But there are proper channels. A mother has reported her baby missing, and the description matches." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. A mother. Someone was looking for Noah. But why would she abandon him in the first place? And at that particular bench? "I need to see your identification and any paperwork you might have for the child," the male officer continued. Daniel handed over his license with trembling fingers. "I don't have any paperwork, just what was with him when I found him." He retrieved the cardboard sign and the hospital bracelet from a drawer. The officers examined the items, their expressions revealing nothing. "We'll need to take the baby into protective custody while this is sorted out," the female officer said. "No," Daniel said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Please, Noah needs consistency. He knows me now." The male officer shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cross, but we have protocols to follow. Child Protective Services has been notified. They'll determine temporary placement until parentage is established." "Can I at least get his things together?" Daniel asked, desperation creeping into his voice. They nodded, and Daniel moved to Noah's room with heavy steps. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that his world was about to change again. Daniel gathered diapers, formula, clothes, and the soft blue blanket Noah loved, packing them into a bag with mechanical precision. When he leaned over the crib, emotion finally overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry, little man," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Noah stirred at the sound of his voice, dark eyes blinking open. Daniel lifted him gently, holding him close for what might be the last time, breathing in his baby scent. "The bag has everything he needs," Daniel explained as he returned to the officers. "He likes being rocked when he's fussy. And there's a lullaby." The female officer nodded sympathetically. "We'll make sure whoever cares for him knows." "May I?" Daniel's voice broke. "May I walk him to the car?" After a moment of consideration, they agreed. Daniel wrapped Noah carefully in his warmest blanket, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead before stepping out into the cold night air. Snow had begun to fall again, delicate flakes swirling in the glow of the streetlights. Daniel huddled protectively over Noah as they walked toward the police cruiser. When they reached the vehicle, the female officer came forward with a car seat. "We'll take good care of him," she assured Daniel. Transferring Noah to the officer's arms was the hardest thing Daniel had ever done. The baby sensed the change and began to cry. Not just any cry, but a sound of recognition and loss that tore through Daniel's chest. He watched helplessly as they secured Noah in the car seat. The baby's cries grew more frantic, his tiny hands reaching out, eyes locked on Daniel through the window. "We'll be in touch about the investigation," the male officer said. "You should consider getting a lawyer, Mr. Cross." Daniel barely heard him. His focus remained entirely on Noah as the car door closed, muffling the baby's cries. The officers climbed into the front seats, and the engine started with a low rumble. As the car pulled away, Daniel stood motionless in the falling snow, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. Only then, alone in the silent night, did he allow himself to break. The front door closed with a hollow thud that echoed through the empty house. Daniel stood in the entrance, keys dangling from his limp fingers. The silence pressed against his ears like a physical weight. Just days ago, this silence would have been normal. Welcome, even. Now it felt wrong. Unbearable. He moved through the darkened rooms without turning on the lights. His boots left wet tracks on the floor, melting snow from his long, aimless walk after the police car had disappeared with Noah inside. In the kitchen, a half-empty bottle of formula sat on the counter. Daniel picked it up, his thumb brushing over the measurement marks he'd carefully followed. Learning how much to feed a baby had been a challenge. Now that knowledge felt like a cruel joke. "Stupid," he muttered, his voice rough. "Stupid to think I could keep him." He walked to the living room, where a blanket lay crumpled on the couch from their afternoon nap. Daniel picked it up, bringing it to his face. It still smelled of baby powder and something uniquely Noah. The scent hit him like a physical blow, dropping him heavily onto the couch. The house had never felt so empty, so cold. On the coffee table sat a small stuffed bear Maggie had brought over. Noah had been too young to really play with it, but he'd grabbed at its ears with his tiny hands. Daniel reached for it now, running his calloused thumb over the soft fabric. "I failed you," he whispered. "Just like I failed everyone else." Images of Emily flooded his mind. His daughter at 5, with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. At 10, reading books far too advanced for her age. At 16, tears streaming down her face as she screamed that she hated him. The day she left, suitcase in hand, vowing never to return. And now Noah was gone too. Daniel's gaze drifted to the side table where he'd placed the hospital bracelet. He picked it up, tracing the partial name with his finger. Cross. The name he'd once given his daughter. The name that suggested Noah might be his grandson. His hands began to shake. If Noah really was Emily's son, why had she abandoned him? Why at the same bench where Daniel had been left as a child? It couldn't be coincidence. She must have known Daniel would find him there. But why not come to him directly? Unless she wasn't sure he'd changed. Unless she was testing him. And now he'd failed that test. He'd lost Noah to the same system that had failed Daniel himself as a child. The thought of Noah in foster care, being passed from home to home like Daniel had been, made his stomach clench. He couldn't let that happen. Not to Noah. Not to his grandson. Daniel stood abruptly, the stuffed bear clutched in his hand. He paced the room, mind racing. He needed to find Emily. She was the key to getting Noah back. But he hadn't seen or heard from her in years, wouldn't even know where to begin looking. He'd need help, legal help, and he'd need to prove he could provide a stable home for Noah. Daniel glanced around his sparse living room. The place had been just fine for a solitary biker. But through Noah's eyes, through the eyes of authorities who would judge his fitness as a guardian, what would they see? A cold, empty house. A man with a questionable past. A Hell's Angel with no business raising a child. He sank back onto the couch, head in his hands. For the first time in decades, Daniel felt tears burning behind his eyes. Hot, painful tears he'd learned to suppress long ago. One escaped, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. In the silence of the night, something shifted inside him. The same fierce protectiveness he'd felt when he'd first found Noah in the snow. It hardened into resolve, becoming something stronger than grief. Dawn found Daniel still sitting on the couch, the stuffed bear in his hands. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, but clear and focused. The first light of morning filtered through the curtains, illuminating the small reminders of Noah scattered throughout the room. Daniel stood, his decision made. He wasn't going to let Noah go without a fight. He would find Emily. He would prove he could be the father, the grandfather they both deserved. For the first time in his life, Daniel Cross was going to fight for his family. The morning light spilled across Daniel's kitchen table where maps, old phone books, and scribbled notes lay scattered. He hadn't slept, his mind too busy plotting how to find Emily and get Noah back. His coffee had gone cold, forgotten as he worked through his limited options. Daniel rubbed his eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion. His leather jacket hung over a kitchen chair, and his hair was disheveled from running his hands through it countless times. The house felt emptier without Noah's presence, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. "I'll start with Maggie," he muttered to himself, circling a name on his notepad. "She knows people at the diner who might have seen Emily." He pushed back from the table and stood, stretching his stiff muscles. The clock on the wall read 7:32 a.m. Too early to make calls, but Daniel couldn't sit still any longer. He needed to do something, anything, to feel like he was making progress. He walked to the coffee pot to pour another cup, when a sound stopped him. A car door closing outside his house. Daniel froze, listening. Footsteps approached his front porch, hesitant and slow. Then silence. Daniel moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. A small rusted sedan sat in his driveway, unfamiliar and out of place. He couldn't see who had been driving. The footsteps started again, climbing his porch steps. Daniel tensed. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this early. Could it be the authorities again? His hand instinctively reached for his phone, ready to call the lawyer he'd been researching. A knock came at the door, soft and uncertain. Almost as if the person on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be heard. Daniel approached cautiously, years of living on edge making him wary of unexpected visitors. Through the small window in his front door, he caught a glimpse of a woman, her face turned away as she stared out at the yard. Something about the slope of her shoulders made his heart skip a beat. He unlocked the door and pulled it open. The woman turned, and time seemed to stop. Hair darker than he remembered, face thinner, but those eyes, he would know those eyes anywhere. They were his own, staring back at him from a face he hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. "Emily," Daniel whispered, the name catching in his throat. She looked different. Gone was the angry teenager who had stormed out of his life. This Emily looked worn down by life, deep shadows beneath her eyes, her hands fidgeting nervously with the zipper of her thin jacket. But beneath the weariness, he saw glimpses of his little girl. The way she bit her bottom lip when nervous, the small mole just above her right eyebrow. "Dad," she said, the word hanging in the air between them like something fragile. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to believe she was really there. His mind raced with questions. How had she found him? Why now? Did she know about Noah? Emily shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable under his stunned gaze. She looked ready to bolt, her body angled slightly toward the steps as if preparing for a quick retreat. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, of worry that mirrored his own. The morning breeze ruffled her hair, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Behind her, the world continued on. Birds calling, a distant car passing. But in the doorway, time stood suspended as father and daughter faced each other after years of silence. Daniel's hands hung uselessly at his sides. Should he reach for her? Would she pull away? His throat tightened with emotions he couldn't name, too numerous and tangled to sort through. Emily's eyes darted past him, scanning the interior of the house visible from the doorway. Searching. When they returned to his face, they were filled with questions and something else. Fear, perhaps, or hope. They stood there, separated by more than just the threshold, two people connected by blood and broken promises, neither knowing what to say after so much time and pain. Daniel stepped back, wordlessly inviting Emily inside. She hesitated before crossing the threshold, her eyes darting around the living room, taking in the changes since she'd last been here. The makeshift baby area in the corner caught her attention. The drawer-turned crib, bottles lined up on the coffee table, tiny clothes folded in a basket. "They took him," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Last night." Emily's face crumpled. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold something in. "I know. That's why I'm here." "You know?" Daniel's brow furrowed. "How would you know unless—" "He's mine," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Noah is my son." The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel staggered slightly, reaching for the back of the couch to steady himself. He'd suspected, of course, after finding the hospital bracelet, but hearing it confirmed made his head spin. "Sit down," he managed, gesturing to the couch. "Please." Emily perched on the edge of the cushion, her posture tense. Daniel remained standing, needing the distance to process what was happening. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would you leave your baby, my grandson, on a bench in the snow? He could have died out there." "I knew you'd find him," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "I'd been watching you. For weeks." "Watching me?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, struggling to make sense of her words. Emily nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I found out where you lived about 2 months ago. I didn't know what to do. I was scared to face you after everything." "So you left Noah on that bench? That specific bench?" Daniel's voice rose despite his effort to stay calm. "Because you'd understand," Emily said, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "It's where they left you. You told me that story when I was little." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. She remembered. All these years later, she remembered the story he'd told her when she was just a child, about how he'd been abandoned. "I couldn't take care of him anymore," Emily continued, her words coming faster now. "I lost my job, then my apartment. I was sleeping in my car. Noah deserved better than that. But I couldn't just give him to strangers." Her voice broke. "I wanted him to have family, real family." "So you left him for me to find," Daniel said slowly, putting the pieces together. "The lullaby? That's why he responded to it. You sang it to him." Emily nodded, a small sob escaping her lips. The same one you used to sing to me. I remember every word. Daniel sank into the chair across from her, overwhelmed. The lullaby that had soothed him as a child, that he had sung to Emily, that she had passed on to Noah, a thread connecting 3 generations of broken people. "Why didn't you just come to me?" he asked, his throat tight with emotion. "Because I failed him, just like—" Emily trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Just like I failed you." Daniel completed the thought, the truth of it painful but undeniable. Emily looked down at her hands. "I was so angry at you for so long, for choosing that life over me." "I never chose anything over you," Daniel said quietly. "I just didn't know how to be what you needed. I thought I was protecting you by keeping my world separate." "But you weren't there when I needed you most," Emily whispered. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the pain in her words. When he opened them, he saw not just the hurt woman before him, but the little girl whose hand he once held, whose tears he once dried. "Noah has your eyes," he said softly, "and your mother's smile." Something in Emily broke at those words. Her shoulders shook as she covered her face with her hands, years of pent-up grief pouring out. Daniel watched, his own vision blurring with tears, the weight of all they'd lost, and all they might still save, pressing on his chest. The silence between them stretched, filled only by Emily's quiet sobs. Daniel wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but years of distance held him back. Instead, he waited, giving her time. Finally, Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I tried so hard to make it work," she said. "After Noah was born, I thought I could do it alone. I really did." "What happened?" Daniel asked gently. Emily's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, snow had started falling again, light flakes dancing in the morning light. "Everything fell apart so fast. The factory where I worked shut down. I couldn't find another job that paid enough for both rent and daycare." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I started selling things. My TV, my jewelry, anything to keep a roof over our heads." Daniel listened, each word adding weight to the burden of his absence. "By the time winter came, we were living in my car." Emily's voice grew hollow. "Noah got sick. Just a cold. But I was so scared. I took him to the clinic, and that's when I realized I couldn't do it anymore. Not like that." "You could have gone to social services," Daniel said, though he understood why she hadn't. Their family had never trusted the system. Emily shook her head. "They would have taken him away, put him with strangers." She looked directly at him now. "I remembered what you told me about being in foster care, how it broke something in you." Daniel flinched at the memory. He'd shared that part of his past with Emily when she was young, trying to explain why he sometimes struggled to show affection. "I started looking for you after that," Emily continued. "It wasn't easy. You had moved, changed numbers." "I left the city after you." Daniel couldn't finish. "After you left me," he wanted to say. "After I drove you away." "I found someone from the old neighborhood who knew where you'd gone," Emily explained. "When I finally found this place, I watched for days. I saw how you lived, alone, quiet. I was afraid at first. Afraid you'd changed too much, or not enough." Daniel understood what she meant. He'd been a hard man when Emily was growing up. Not violent with her, never that, but closed off, wrapped in the armor of his biker life. "But then I noticed something," Emily said, her voice softening. "You helped Mrs. Jenkins next door with her groceries. You fixed Maggie's truck at the diner. You were still you, underneath it all." Daniel hadn't realized she'd been watching him that closely, seeing the small kindnesses he'd never counted as anything special. "That's when I knew," Emily said. That's when I decided. To leave Noah for me to find, Daniel finished. Emily nodded. I left him there that night and called the police from a payphone later, saying I saw someone abandon a baby. I wanted to make sure he'd be found if... She couldn't complete the thought. If I didn't find him, Daniel said. The realization of how much trust she'd placed in him, despite everything, hit him like a physical blow. You believed I would take care of him. I hoped, Emily corrected, vulnerability etched across her face. I prayed. I didn't know for sure what you would do, but I believed that if you found him where you were once left, you might understand. I did, Daniel whispered. The moment I saw him there, something broke open inside me. I watched from across the street, Emily admitted. When you picked him up and took him with you, I cried so hard I could barely breathe. You were there? Daniel asked, stunned. Hidden in the trees, I had to know. She looked down at her hands. I followed you home that night, saw the lights on all night. I knew you were taking care of him. Daniel's mind raced back to that first night with Noah, the panic, the tenderness, the awkward attempts at comfort. All while Emily had been out there somewhere, watching, hoping. Why did you wait so long to come here? He asked. I was scared, she admitted, and ashamed. What kind of mother abandons her baby? But when I heard they took Noah into custody... Her voice broke. I couldn't let him go into the system, not when he has us. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he'd built years ago, suddenly giving way. The enormity of what Emily had done washed over him. Despite everything he'd failed to be for her, she had trusted him with the most precious thing in her life. She had believed in his capacity to love when he himself had forgotten it existed. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his large frame folding in on itself. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate for the years of absence. I'm so sorry, Emily. His voice broke as tears filled his eyes. I should have been there for you, both then and now. Daniel bowed his head, shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. Not just for Noah, but for all the years lost with his daughter, for all the times she had needed him and found only his absence. Later that afternoon, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Daniel placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table and sat across from Emily. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her shoulders slumped with the weight of her confession. They had spent the morning talking about Noah. His smile, his laugh, the way he grabbed Daniel's finger with his tiny hand. For a little while, they had found common ground in their love for the boy. But now, as the conversation lulled, the years of absence between them loomed large again. Daniel cupped his mug, drawing warmth from it. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, he began, his voice low and rough, about why you left Noah where you did. Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her coffee. It made me think about all the ways I failed you, Daniel continued. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I need to say something I should have said years ago. Emily looked up, wariness in her gaze. I'm sorry, Emily. The words felt strange in his mouth, not because he didn't mean them, but because he'd kept them inside for so long. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved. Outside, a bird landed on the feeder hanging from the porch, its wings fluttering against the window. Daniel watched it for a moment, gathering his thoughts. After your mom died, I was lost. I didn't know how to be both parents to you. So I became neither. His fingers tightened around the mug. I chose the club, the road, anything that would take me away from the pain of losing her. And in doing that, I lost you too. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she raised her coffee to her lips. I told myself I was providing for you, sending money home to your aunt when you went to live with her. Daniel shook his head. But that wasn't what you needed. You needed me to be present, to show up for your school plays and birthdays, to help with homework and teach you to drive. His voice cracked. To be your dad. The bird at the feeder took flight, disappearing into the trees. Daniel watched it go, then turned back to his daughter. When you left at 17, I was angry. Not at you, at myself. But I didn't know how to fix it, so I just let you go. He swallowed hard. That was the biggest mistake of my life. Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She set her mug down, carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. Every day since then, I've carried that regret, Daniel continued. I would see young fathers with their kids and feel this hollow ache, knowing what I'd thrown away. He paused. Then Noah showed up, and suddenly I had a second chance to get it right. But it wasn't just about him. It was about honoring what I should have done for you. A tear slid down Emily's cheek. She brushed it away quickly. I don't expect forgiveness, Daniel said. I know I hurt you too deeply for that. But I want you to know that I see it now, all of it. How much I missed, how much damage I did. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. And I promise you, if we get Noah back, I'll be there. For both of you. In all the ways I wasn't before. Emily looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. The hardened biker who had intimidated so many now sat before her vulnerable, his eyes pleading for understanding. I believed in you, she said softly. Even when I was angry, even when I felt abandoned, some part of me always believed in you. That's why I brought Noah here. She hesitated, then slowly placed her hand in his. Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers, rough calluses against her smoother skin. I can't say it's all forgiven, Emily admitted. There's too much hurt for that. But I want to try. Her voice grew stronger. For Noah. For us. Daniel nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. This small bridge between them felt fragile but real. The first step toward healing what had been broken for so long. The following morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of Daniel's small kitchen as Emily sat at the table, nervously arranging papers. She wore a simple blue blouse she'd borrowed from a thrift store, the nicest thing she owned. Daniel entered from the bedroom wearing a clean button-down shirt, his long hair neatly tied back. You look different, Emily said, surprise in her voice. Daniel tugged uncomfortably at his collar. Figured they'd take us more seriously if I didn't look like... He gestured vaguely at himself. Like a Hell's Angel? Emily finished, a small smile playing at her lips. Daniel nodded. Like someone they'd expect to find trouble. He joined her at the table, reviewing the documents they'd gathered overnight. Birth certificates, hospital records, and a hastily written statement from Emily explaining the circumstances of Noah's birth and why she'd left him for Daniel to find. Do you think it'll be enough? Emily asked, her fingers tracing the edge of her birth certificate, the paper that proved she was Daniel's daughter. I don't know, Daniel admitted. But we have to try. The drive to the County Family Services office was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel parked his truck, borrowed from his neighbor since his motorcycle wouldn't work for this, and turned to Emily. Whatever happens in there, he said, we stick together. Emily nodded, the gesture tentative, but determined. The waiting room was bright and sterile, with colorful posters about family safety covering beige walls. A receptionist directed them to hard plastic chairs where they sat, shoulders almost touching, for nearly an hour. Daniel's leg bounced with nervous energy, while Emily twisted a tissue in her hands. Finally, a door opened, and a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a serious expression called them back. "I'm Mrs. Winters, the case supervisor for Noah's situation," she explained, leading them to a small conference room. "I understand you have information about the child." Emily spoke first, her voice shaking slightly. "He's my son," she said, "and this is my father, Noah's grandfather." Mrs. Winters looked between them, her expression carefully neutral as she took notes. "The child was found abandoned. That's a serious matter." Daniel leaned forward. "I found him," he said. "Where he was left for me to find him." "Left specifically for you?" Mrs. Winters raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Daniel pulled out a worn photograph. "At the same bench where I was abandoned as a child." Emily looked at her father in surprise. She hadn't known he'd kept a picture of that place. As Mrs. Winters reviewed their documents, Emily explained her struggles, the poverty, the depression after Noah's birth, her fear of failing him the way she felt failed as a child. "I made a terrible choice," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "But I never meant to abandon him forever. I left him where I knew his grandfather would find him." Daniel reached over and placed his hand on Emily's shoulder. "Noah belongs with his family," he said firmly. "With both of us." Mrs. Winters studied them carefully. "Mr. Cross, your record shows several arrests in your younger years." Daniel nodded, not denying it. "I've made mistakes, but in the weeks I've had Noah, he's changed me." He met the woman's gaze directly. "I know what it's like to grow up without parents who care. I won't let that happen to Noah." The meeting stretched on for another hour. They answered questions about living arrangements, support systems, and plans for Noah's future. Daniel described the nursery he'd built, while Emily detailed her commitment to getting proper help for her depression. Mrs. Winters closed her folder. "I need to consult with my team. Please wait here." The 30 minutes she was gone felt like days. Daniel and Emily sat in silence, until Emily whispered, "Thank you for being here." Daniel looked at his daughter, really looked at her, seeing both the girl he'd lost and the woman she'd become. "I should have been there all along," he replied quietly. The door opened. Mrs. Winters returned with a young man carrying a car seat. Inside, bundled in a blue blanket, was Noah. "Given the circumstances and your clear commitment to the child's well-being," Mrs. Winters said, "we're granting temporary custody to both of you with mandatory follow-up visits." She offered a small smile. "It seems Noah belongs with his family after all." Emily's hand flew to her mouth as a sob escaped. Daniel stood frozen, unable to believe what he was seeing. Then Noah made a small cooing sound, and both of them moved forward together, reaching for the child who had somehow brought them back to each other. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Daniel's borrowed truck pulled up to the small house. Emily sat in the passenger seat, cradling Noah, who slept peacefully against her chest. For a moment, they simply sat there, the engine's rumble fading to silence. "We're home," Daniel said softly, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. Not just his home anymore. Their home. Emily nodded, gazing down at Noah's sleeping face. He looked so peaceful, like none of this ever happened. "Kids are good that way," Daniel said, opening his door. "They live in the now." Inside the house, Emily paused in the entryway, taking in the modest living room with its worn furniture. Her eyes caught on small changes: a baby blanket folded on the couch, a rattle on the coffee table, formula cans lined neatly on a kitchen shelf. "You really got ready for him," she said, surprise in her voice. Daniel shrugged, embarrassed. "Didn't know what I was doing. Just figured he needed stuff." Emily walked slowly through the house, Noah still sleeping against her shoulder. She stopped at the doorway to what had once been a storage room. Now it held a simple crib, a changing table made from a repurposed dresser, and walls freshly painted a soft blue. "You did all this?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, watching her face. "It's not much. It's perfect." Emily's voice cracked. She gently laid Noah in the crib, adjusting his blanket with trembling hands. They stood side by side, watching Noah sleep. The silence between them wasn't comfortable yet, but it wasn't painful either. It was new, like everything else about this strange family they were becoming. "Are you hungry?" Daniel finally asked. "I could make something." Emily looked surprised. "You cook?" A small smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "I wouldn't call it cooking, but I can put food on plates." In the kitchen, Daniel pulled sandwich fixings from the refrigerator while Emily washed her hands at the sink. The simple domestic scene felt surreal to them both. "I never thought I'd be back here," Emily said quietly, drying her hands on a dish towel. "In this house." Daniel paused, bread in hand. "I'm glad you are." They worked around each other, finding an awkward rhythm as they prepared a simple meal. Daniel showed Emily where things were kept, and she noticed how the kitchen had barely changed since her childhood. The same chipped mugs, the same ancient coffee maker. "You still keep the peanut butter in the refrigerator," she observed, pulling out the jar. "Old habits," Daniel replied. As they sat at the table eating their sandwiches, the baby monitor crackled with Noah's soft breathing sounds. "What happens now?" Emily asked, picking at the crust of her sandwich. Daniel took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about that. There's an extra bedroom. It's yours, if you want it, for as long as you need." "You'd let us stay?" Emily's voice was small. "You're his mother," Daniel said simply. "And you're my daughter." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel cleared his throat. "We've got those follow-up visits with family services, and I figured maybe you could look into those programs the social worker mentioned, for the depression stuff." Emily nodded slowly. "I want to do better. For Noah and—" She hesitated. "For myself, too." As evening settled over the house, they moved to the living room. Noah woke for a feeding, and Emily sat on the couch cradling him with a bottle. Daniel watched from his armchair, still amazed at how natural she looked with the baby. "He has your eyes," Daniel said suddenly. Emily looked up, surprised. "Everyone used to say I had yours." The simple observation bridged something between them, an acknowledgement of their shared blood, their connection that went beyond the mistakes and the years apart. When Noah finished eating, Emily hesitated, then held him out. "Do you want to hold him?" Daniel took the baby carefully, settling him against his chest. Noah yawned, his tiny hand finding Daniel's finger and holding on. They sat like that as darkness fell outside. Grandfather,